Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. She kissed her kids goodnight. She brushed her teeth. She said she'd go for a walk at sunrise. 8 hours later, her charred remains were found locked in the passenger seat of a burning SUV miles from home. And her husband, a decorated fire captain, just went on with his day like nothing happened. This isn't just a case of murder. It's a case of calculated silence, staged like an accident and nearly perfect. Until it wasn't. Arrowhead Road isn't the kind of place you'd expect to find death by fire. It cuts through a stretch of frozen woods in Blue Mountains, Ontario, quiet, steeped in early morning fog, mostly used by locals heading to the ski trails or rural runners looking for solitude. But on January 26, 2023, just after 6 o'clock a.m., that silence broke with a black plume rising through the snow-laced trees. A local resident on his way to work spotted the flames first. He pulled over, got out, and dialed 911. The call was short, tight, controlled. "There's a car on fire off Arrowhead. No movement. Looks bad." Fire crews from the area were dispatched immediately, arriving just minutes later. The vehicle in question was a black SUV, fully engulfed when responders pulled up. The fire was concentrated inside the cabin, originating from the front seat. Flames had begun to melt the dash, climbing fast into the roofliner. The license plates were warped but legible. Ontario plates registered locally. As the blaze was extinguished, crews noted a disturbing detail: doors locked from the outside, no signs of a crash, and a body in the passenger seat, burnt beyond recognition. There were no skid marks on the road, no debris, no sign of an accident. The vehicle hadn't hit a tree, a ditch, or another car. It had simply stopped, neatly, quietly, and caught fire. And the fire hadn't spread from the engine, as typical in accidents. It had originated inside the cabin, almost deliberately. What stood out most to the first responders was how controlled the scene felt. As one veteran firefighter later put it in a statement, "It wasn't messy. That's the thing. Most car fires are chaos, broken glass, torn metal, open airbags. This one felt staged." That initial suspicion, though unspoken, would haunt the investigation in the days to come. The body was removed and sent for forensic examination. The medical examiner's early notes were cautious: female, likely middle-aged, signs of perimortem thermal damage. But here's where things took a turn. There were no clear indicators of blunt force trauma, no fractures to the skull or ribs, no lacerations. But most importantly, there was no soot in the airway. She hadn't inhaled the fire. That one detail shifted the nature of the case immediately. Because when someone dies in a fire, there's almost always soot in the trachea or lungs, evidence they were alive when the flames started. This victim, she was dead before the fire began. The burning, it seemed, was just cleanup. While the autopsy was still pending, investigators turned to vehicle registration. The SUV belonged to Ashley Milnes Schwalm, 40 years old, mother of two, known resident of Collingwood, a small community just under 40 minutes away. Police sent a unit to her last known address. Her husband answered the door. James Schwalm, age 40, former fire captain with Brampton Fire Services. No criminal record, known in the community. His demeanor, composed, not alarmed, not panicked. According to the officers, he said his wife had gone for a morning hike. "She usually leaves early," he told them. "I figured she'd be back by now." That statement set off quiet alarms. It was now 8:30 a.m. The SUV had been on fire for at least an hour. If she had gone for a hike, why hadn't he called her, checked her location, reported her missing? He hadn't called anyone. Ashley's phone was still in the house, on her nightstand, charging. Her purse was untouched. Her keys were missing. And the clothes she usually wore on morning walks, thermal leggings, fleece jacket, neon beanie, were gone. But the weather that morning had been brutal. -15 Celsius, icy roads, and wind chills dipping below freezing. Not ideal for a casual walk at dawn. The children, still asleep when police arrived, were later taken to stay with James's mother. Social workers initiated a temporary custody order as standard protocol. Investigators quietly sealed off the house. They didn't have a warrant yet, but they didn't like what they were seeing. One detective would later describe it like this: "There's this moment in an investigation where everything lines up too clean. Timeline, Alibi, emotional response. When things look perfect, that's usually when they're not. Over the next 6 hours, police confirmed the burned body was indeed Ashley. Dental records were used to make the match. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation, not thermal injury. Deep bruising to the neck muscles. No hyoid fracture, but sufficient pressure to occlude airflow. Time of death estimated between 4:30 and 5:30 a.m. At the same time, surveillance footage was pulled from homes around Arrowhead Road. Most cameras in the area were oriented toward driveways or garage entries, but one rural home, located near a bend on Arrowhead, captured something just before 6 o'clock a.m. A dark vehicle, no headlights, moving slowly, turning into a clearing, stopping, then nothing. Less than 10 minutes later, a glow began to rise through the tree line. The camera didn't catch the fire directly, but the timeline was set, and police had a name, a body, a location, and now, suspicion. As the first 24 hours came to a close, one thing was clear. Ashley Schwalm had not died on a hike. She hadn't died accidentally, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the truth stayed buried, along with her. By 9 o'clock a.m. on January 26, 2023, while forensic techs were still photographing the burned-out SUV off Arrowhead Road, a second team was pulling records from Ashley Schwalm's workplace in Collingwood. She hadn't shown up for work, she hadn't called, she hadn't canceled meetings. And for someone known for showing up early and over-prepared, her absence wasn't just noticeable. It was alarming. Ashley, 40, was a full-time financial administrator for a mid-sized construction firm on the west side of town. She'd held the job for over 8 years. Co-workers described her as reliable, meticulous, and often the first person to arrive. Emails from the company system showed she last logged off just after 5:30 p.m. the day before. There were no follow-up messages, no out-of-office reply. By all accounts, she hadn't mentioned any plans to take time off. Investigators compiled a brief background profile. Ashley Milnes Schwalm, 2 children, ages 6 and 9, lived in Collingwood with her husband James and no prior criminal record. She had no known mental health diagnoses, wasn't on medication, and hadn't reported any recent emotional distress to her healthcare provider. Her social media, though minimal, showed a timeline of typical family life, school pickup photos, holiday gatherings, and birthday cakes. But one thing caught the team's attention. Ashley had recently changed her emergency contact from James to her sister, living in Kitchener. The change happened in December 2022, just 6 weeks before her death. Meanwhile, police obtained a copy of the Schwalm family's security system logs. Although the home had no active surveillance video, it had a motion-triggered front door sensor and smart lock. No door was recorded as opening between 10 o'clock p.m. on January 25th and 7:15 a.m. on the 26th. The log showed no recorded departure that would match James's account of Ashley leaving early for a hike. That discrepancy became the first data point investigators marked red. Ashley's phone, recovered from her bedroom nightstand, was powered off but intact. A digital forensic specialist began the extraction process. Initial analysis showed the last text message she received came in at 10:12 p.m. A good night from a friend, which she read but didn't reply to. No other outgoing messages or app activity were recorded after that. Her fitness tracker, synced to the phone, showed a flat line of movement between 11 o'clock p.m. and 6:30 a.m. No steps, no elevation gain, no heart rate spike. There was no recorded morning walk. The last verifiable movement was around 9:47 p.m. when she had gone from the kitchen to the upstairs bedroom. No signs of life after that. During canvassing, investigators spoke with the Schwalm family's neighbors. One noted that James's mother had arrived the evening of January 25th and stayed overnight, something they considered unusual. Another neighbor living across the street stated he did not see any vehicle leave the driveway early that morning. No headlights, no engine noise, no tire tracks in the fresh snow. Forensic investigators later confirmed that the Schwalm driveway was undisturbed. Snowfall during the night had left a uniform surface. No departure vehicle would have gone unnoticed. Ashley never left on her own. The working theory shifted quietly, from accident to disappearance to foul play. By noon that day, law enforcement conducted a preliminary welfare check on the children and obtained verbal consent to begin processing the Schwalm residence as a potential secondary crime scene. No arrests, no formal statements, just quiet, calculated steps. Inside the master bedroom, they found Ashley's wallet still in her purse. Her government-issued ID, bank cards, and insurance documents were untouched. In her closet, her hiking boots were missing. But oddly, the thermal leggings she wore on nearly every morning walk were still folded in the drawer. She had at least 3 matching sets. The pair missing had last been seen on her by her youngest child, who told officers, "That's what Mommy wore when she tucked us in." Another inconsistency. Ashley's gloves were accounted for in a basket near the front door, but her windbreaker, a bright teal Columbia jacket, was gone. The jacket would later be identified in the autopsy report as partially fused to the remains found in the SUV. Detectives retrieved Ashley's work laptop and personal tablet. Both had been used routinely until the night of January 25th, then powered off. No recent downloads, no searches flagged, but one file stood out, an encrypted document saved to her desktop the week before, labeled Finances 2022 Private. The password hint, only me. The file was forwarded to digital forensics. On the refrigerator, pinned under a magnet, was a printed weekly schedule. Monday through Friday listed school drop-offs, pickups, meal preps. Saturday noted grocery, 10 a.m., Ash alone. Sunday read church, 9 a.m. But Thursday, January 26th, was blank. No handwritten notes, just white space. As one detective later recalled, "It's what wasn't written that bothered us. Every day was detailed, but Thursday was silent." By early evening, the investigative team had formed a 3-layer working profile. Ashley had not left the home under her own power. The timeline given by her husband didn't match physical data. The fire that killed her was not an accident. It was a post-mortem event, and while no suspect had yet been named publicly, internal records noted James Schwalm as the last known contact. Detectives were now reviewing his employment history, former colleagues, and any possible conflicts. A public request for information had not yet been issued. At this point, discretion remained key. This wasn't a crime solved by witnesses. It was one that would be unspooled through habits, devices, and absence. On the morning Ashley Schwalm's body was identified, James Schwalm was in his living room. He was not at the police station. He was not searching the streets. He wasn't on the phone with friends or family. He was sitting on the couch with his children, watching cartoons. To the officers who had just confirmed the most violent outcome imaginable, that behavior raised concern, not because of how shocking it looked on paper, but because of how normal it seemed in person. The controlled demeanor, the consistency in his tone, the absence of any signs of disruption, that wasn't grief, that was strategy. James Schwalm, age 40, was a former captain with Brampton Fire Services. He retired early in 2020 after nearly 2 decades of service. His personnel file described him as competent, by the book, and occasionally rigid. Internal reviews showed no disciplinary actions, but colleagues remembered him as a man who didn't ask for help and rarely gave more information than he had to. In interviews, former co-workers offered similar impressions: punctual, no-nonsense, well-versed in fire protocol, but none recalled him ever bringing up his wife or kids outside of obligation. He wasn't known to be social. He wasn't known to be unkind. He was simply hard to read. Investigators began compiling a behavioral profile. James was trained in scene control, thermal spread, accelerant identification, and fire staging. His certification record included advanced arson investigation coursework and vehicle fire simulations. In short, he knew how to set a fire and how to make it look like he didn't, but knowledge alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed action. They reviewed James's formal statement from January 26th. According to him, Ashley had woken up early, dressed for a hike, and left the house around 5 o'clock a.m. He said he didn't see her leave, but he assumed she took the SUV. He claimed she did this often, especially on stressful weeks. He said she liked the solitude, but physical evidence had already disproven that version. The house's smart lock system showed no door activity. Her phone remained in the bedroom. Her hiking clothes were inconsistently chosen. Her boots were gone, but gloves remained. Her steps were not recorded on her fitness tracker, and no one, no neighbor, no passerby, saw her depart that morning. When pressed gently in a second interview, James didn't shift. His story didn't change. His voice stayed level. That consistency became its own anomaly. One detective recorded in his notes, "People lie in layers. Their stories drift slightly. Details evolve." But James, his narrative didn't move, and that was unnatural. That same day, digital analysts pulled James's cell phone logs. His device had remained powered on from the night of January 25th through the entire next day. No outgoing calls were made between midnight and 10 a.m., not even to Ashley. That alone might be excused, if it weren't for the fact that Ashley's SUV was already in flames by 6 o'clock a.m. The first message James sent was at 7:14 a.m. A text to Ashley. "Hope you had a good walk." A full hour after she was already dead. Investigators subpoenaed James's laptop and iCloud account. The forensic team found a cleared browser history spanning the prior 7 days. Upon recovery, it revealed targeted searches made in the early morning hours on January 24th and 25th. How to destroy vehicle DNA evidence. Will life insurance pay if death is accidental? How to set car fire slow burn. The phrasing wasn't subtle. The intent wasn't ambiguous. But legal standards required more. Investigators returned to the Schwalm residence, this time with a warrant. They processed the garage, utility room, and vehicle keys. Inside a storage bin in the garage, they found an empty plastic gas canister with a trace odor of accelerant. A nearby rag tested positive for gasoline. Ashley's SUV, now stored off-site for forensic re-examination, had signs of pour patterns from the passenger footwell to the center console. The spread suggested manual dispersion of liquid fuel. Burn patterns supported a conclusion that the fire was deliberately initiated in a concentrated location to maximize damage to the body and obscure cause of death. And yet that cause was already known. Ashley Schwalm had been strangled. The autopsy was clear. Bruising of the neck musculature, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, but no damage to the hyoid bone. It was controlled pressure, not a frenzy, not a fight. The killer had not acted in a rush. At this point in the investigation, no formal charges had been filed. But James Schwalm was no longer just a person of interest. He was now the focus of an evolving homicide inquiry. What disturbed detectives most wasn't his background or his browser history. It was his behavior in the hours after his wife's death. He made no attempt to check on her, no calls to police, no inquiries to neighbors or family. He made the school lunches. He drove the kids. He told them nothing. One child later told a social worker, "Daddy said Mommy went on a long hike and might be gone a while." To investigators, that wasn't coping. That was rehearsed. By January 27th, James had been scheduled for a formal third interview. This time, with homicide detectives present. The interview was voluntary. James agreed to come in. The night before, he deleted several folders from his laptop. They were recovered. By the third day of the investigation, attention shifted from theory to physical reconstruction. The body had already told investigators when Ashley died and how, but now they needed to determine where and why her final moments were obscured by fire. The SUV had been towed from Arrowhead Road to a secured forensics facility in Simcoe County. The interior was a blackened shell, melted plastic, scorched metal, fiberglass residue. But despite the damage, investigators began the slow, methodical task of charting the fire's progression, temperature signature, and accelerant pathways. In cases like this, post-mortem burning isn't just an afterthought, it's intent. Fire, especially vehicle fire, is used to destroy DNA, mask time of death, and eliminate trace evidence. But fire is imperfect, it leaves behind patterns. And in trained hands, those patterns can reconstruct everything. Fire investigators first documented ignition points. The burn signature originated in the passenger side floorboard. The surrounding carpet had been fully consumed, but foam remnants embedded in the seat base revealed what they called micro-scorching, an irregular pattern indicating accelerant pooling. Liquid accelerants behave differently than engine fires. They soak and spread. They follow gravity and find soft materials. Here, the burn pattern spread outward in a radial fan consistent with manual dispersion. The gas tank remained intact. The engine showed no signs of combustion. The ignition system was unaffected. There had been no crash, no spark from wiring, no electrical malfunction. This fire had been started from inside, using an external accelerant. and that point was now fixed. Investigators next reviewed the burn rate. Vehicle fires typically reach full involvement within 5 to 8 minutes. Based on damage to structural components, temperature melt points, and the absence of full aluminum collapse, this blaze had burned for approximately 12 minutes before being extinguished. It had not run its course. It was interrupted, called in too early. The man who said it had likely expected more time. Forensic teams then examined the passenger seat's locking mechanism. It was engaged. The door had been closed and locked manually. Airbags had not deployed. Seatbelt latches were still in place but unused. There were no drag marks in the snow leading to the vehicle. That indicated the body was moved into the car well before it reached Arrowhead Road. Meanwhile, trace samples from the vehicle interior were compared to materials recovered from the Schwalm garage. On-site, investigators had found a red 5-liter jerry can. It was empty, but the inside lining still held faint chemical residue. Lab results confirmed the presence of gasoline additives consistent with fuel sold in the area. The same chemical profile was pulled from the passenger seat foam. Additionally, a half-melted rag, recovered from the SUV's footwell, had embedded fibers traced back to a towel set sold exclusively at a local department store. Transaction logs showed James Schwalm had purchased that exact set the previous year. The forensics narrative was taking shape. Ashley was killed prior to ignition. Her body was placed in the SUV's passenger seat. Gasoline was poured in a deliberate pattern. The fire was set to destroy evidence, not kill. The person responsible had both motive and fire training. Back at the station, the lead investigator reviewed the scene photos from Arrowhead Road. Something still felt off. The SUV had not crashed. The car had been parked at an angle but straight. The wheels were aligned. No impact marks on the undercarriage. No sign of abrupt stop. It had been guided into place, intentionally. In his field notes, he wrote, "Even in how the car stopped, there was control. This wasn't panic, it was execution." Another anomaly was tire compression. The vehicle's tires showed deflation consistent with sitting still for several hours. Yet, per timeline, it had only been there since 5:50 a.m. The likely cause: low air intentionally released to prevent movement post-placement. A subtle touch, but not an amateur one. As a fire captain, James would have understood all of this. But so would anyone who'd researched how to create the illusion of a burned-out accident. The problem: this wasn't an illusion anymore. This was a crime scene that hadn't burned enough. The final element came from the air filter housing inside the SUV. These components often trap debris during combustion. Inside the filter, analysts found 2 partially singed human hairs. DNA testing matched Ashley Schwalm's. The fact that her hair had remained in the car, unburned in some places, further reinforced the early timeline of her death. She had died before the fire, she had been moved, and she had been burned not to hurt her, but to erase her. As this phase of the investigation closed, the forensics team submitted a 29-page report. Its final conclusion was clear. This event was an intentional post-mortem burn using an external accelerant. The ignition source originated in the passenger compartment. The fire served no practical cause beyond concealment of homicide. The fire hadn't fooled investigators, but it had delayed the truth, just long enough for the person responsible to stage an ordinary mourning. As physical evidence locked in the fire as a calculated post-mortem act, investigators shifted their focus to the only witness that couldn't be silenced: James Schwalm's digital footprint. On January 29, 2023, just hours after the fire scene was secured, investigators executed a judicially authorized warrant to seize all electronics inside the Schwalm residence. This included a desktop computer in the basement office, 2 iPads, and a personal mobile device belonging to James. Forensic imaging began the same day, using a write block duplicator to ensure data integrity. The first irregularity surfaced within the browser cache. On James Schwalm's desktop, search records revealed a disturbing pattern. Less than 2 weeks prior to the fire, on January 13th and again on January 18th, he visited forums discussing vehicle combustion temps, burning upholstery materials, and how long it takes to destroy DNA in fire. These weren't idle curiosity searches. The search strings were specific, functional, and goal-oriented. They weren't theoretical, they were preparatory. A deeper analysis showed those search sessions lasted for over 40 minutes each. They weren't accidental clicks. They were part of a deliberate inquiry into postmortem concealment via combustion. The browser also showed visits to insurance comparison websites and 2 local property listing portals. James had been browsing homes in the $550,000 to $600,000 range. According to the Schwalm family's last filed mortgage declaration, their current home had a remaining balance of $218,000. The math was telling. Someone was planning to liquidate, relocate, and restart. Financial records obtained through court order corroborated these findings. On January 24th, 4 days before the fire, James had called Ashley's life insurance provider. The agent's notes confirmed he inquired about policy coverage in the event of accidental car death and non-crash vehicle fire. While phrased as curiosity, the timing was now impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Digital timestamps also revealed that, on the night of January 27th, just before the early morning fire, James had backed up his phone to an external hard drive. The backup included call logs, message threads, and deleted media caches. Analysts recovered a fragment of a deleted voice note labeled Ash Discussion from 2 days prior. It was too corrupted for playback but indicated an attempt to preserve or review a prior argument. Metadata from his iPhone Health app placed him walking approximately 2,400 steps between 2:11 a.m. and 3:02 a.m. Within the window of time, the prosecution would later argue he moved Ashley's body to the SUV and drove it to Arrowhead Road. That walking pattern was inconsistent with any routine nighttime activity in the Schwalm home. Moreover, cell tower data confirmed that James's device had traveled away from the home during the early hours of January 28th, pinging near a tower just 2 kilometers from the site where the SUV was found burning. Combined, these digital fragments painted a sequence that no longer relied on direct confession or circumstantial guesses. It showed knowledge, planning, movement, and motive, all encoded in timestamps and metadata. In the language of digital forensics, it was damning. Investigators also reviewed text messages between James and a close friend. In a thread dated January 10th, James had texted, "If I could reset everything, I would. Honestly, I wish I could start fresh. She's just not the same person anymore." While not incriminating on its own, it reflected a deteriorating relationship. A follow-up message on January 20th read, "She's planning to cut me out of everything. I saw her emails. I won't be blindsided." This suggested motive beyond conflict. It suggested fear of financial exclusion. Interviews with Ashley's colleagues later confirmed she had recently consulted with an attorney to revise her will. James had not been informed. What digital evidence lacks in emotion, it makes up for in clarity. Each byte, each timestamp, each ping tower told a story that matched, down to the minute, with what forensic analysts found in ash, soot, and blood residue. At this point in the investigation, the case was no longer about proving there was a crime. It had become a question of proving who had orchestrated it, when they made that decision, and how much they were willing to risk to rewrite the ending. There comes a moment in every homicide investigation when the weight of deception begins to crack under the pressure of cold facts. For Ontario Provincial Police, that moment arrived on February 3, 2023, just weeks after Ashley Schwalm's scorched remains were recovered from the burned-out SUV on Arrowhead Road. Her husband, James Schwalm, had maintained a carefully constructed narrative until that point. A tragic accident, he claimed. A fire that got out of control. Nothing more. But the evidence, both digital and physical, had begun to contradict him at every turn. By the 6th hour of his formal interview, detectives had laid out a clear forensic timeline. One built from thermal residue patterns, the lack of fuel splash indicators inside the cabin, and most damning of all, the absence of any accelerant on Ashley's clothing. If she'd been alive when the fire began, there should have been defensive burns or smoke inhalation damage in her lungs. The autopsy found neither. She was dead before the fire started. It wasn't a car accident. It was a staging. Detectives had also received the toxicology report by then. Ashley's bloodstream contained trace amounts of a sedative, not prescribed to her, but found in James's home office, a detail that would prove crucial in shaping the prosecution's argument later. The sedative, lorazepam, can induce drowsiness, confusion, and, in higher doses, unconsciousness. Combined with the blunt force trauma discovered at the base of her skull, a different narrative began to surface, one far removed from the accidental death James initially claimed. Investigators didn't push him with anger. They didn't yell. What they did was far more effective. They showed him the browser search history. James had searched vehicle fire accelerant and car explosion temperature days before the incident. He had also looked up the average cremation time and whether burn injuries could obscure pre-existing wounds in autopsies. No one searches those terms by coincidence. James grew silent. The shift in his body language was unmistakable. His hands, previously open and expressive, clenched. His eye contact broke. Then came the pivotal moment. He asked for water, not out of thirst, but as a delay tactic, a way to stall. Investigators didn't interrupt. They waited. When he returned, he asked a question that wasn't on the script. What happens if someone didn't mean to go that far? It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was the first fracture. Detectives let him talk. The version he offered was deliberately vague. He said they'd fought, that Ashley had fallen, that panic set in, that he'd tried to handle it. Still, he refused to admit to causing her death directly. Instead, he clung to the idea of a cover-up gone wrong, fearing judgment more than justice. But what he didn't realize was that his phone had also betrayed him. A deleted video, recovered through forensic tools, showed him hours before the fire, alone in the garage, holding a container of gasoline, time-stamped, undeniable. That piece of evidence, paired with the timing of Ashley's last known phone activity, sealed the sequence. She was dead by 6:14 p.m. James called 911 at 9:03 p.m. That left nearly 3 hours unaccounted for, time he used to stage the scene. Prosecutors would later frame this as an intentional act, carried out with clinical precision by someone trained to manipulate fire scenes. It was a damning indictment, especially coming from someone who once served as a first responder, a man sworn to protect life, now accused of weaponizing his knowledge to erase one. This chapter of the investigation marked the full pivot from suspicion to near certainty. While James hadn't signed a confession, his statements under pressure, the circumstantial cascade of forensic data, and the calculated behavior all aligned against him. What began as a routine arson inquiry had now evolved into a homicide case, meticulously documented, logically irrefutable, and increasingly devoid of plausible denial. At the heart of this case wasn't just a fire, it was the betrayal of someone who had the expertise to make death look like misfortune. But even the most carefully constructed lies eventually collapse under the weight of scientific truth. The shift from suspicion to formal charges in a homicide case is more than procedural. It marks the legal recognition that intent has been identified, evidence substantiated, and the threshold of probable cause crossed. In early February 2023, that moment arrived for James Schwalm. Following the forensic deconstruction of his narrative, Ontario Provincial Police, collaborating with Crown prosecutors, moved swiftly to secure a charge of second-degree murder. The allegation was specific, that James Schwalm caused the death of Ashley Schwalm, his wife of nearly 2 decades, and staged a vehicle fire to conceal the crime. His background as a former firefighter was a notable aggravating factor, giving him both the means and knowledge to simulate a fatal accident. James was arrested at his home in Hanover, Ontario. He offered no resistance. Authorities executed a search warrant simultaneously at his residence and on his secondary devices. A desktop computer and 2 external hard drives were collected. Though initial findings focused heavily on the browser search history recovered from his phone, investigators anticipated that deeper forensic imaging would reveal longer-term patterns, perhaps pointing to premeditation beyond the immediate days before Ashley's death. At his first court appearance, James appeared via video link, wearing an orange jumpsuit, hands visibly shaking. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. The court denied bail, citing the nature of the charge, the risk of flight, and the calculated nature of the alleged crime. The Crown emphasized the suspect's expertise in fire-related scenarios, noting this was not a panicked act, but one designed to obstruct investigation through combustion. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early summer, but in the weeks that followed, the focus turned outward, toward the community that once viewed James as a neighbor, a father, and a public servant. Those roles were now under scrutiny. Interviews with close acquaintances, many of whom had never suspected marital strain, were revisited. One witness, a former colleague, recalled James expressing disdain toward emotional dependency, a statement that, in hindsight, seemed detached when viewed against the backdrop of Ashley's vulnerability. Ashley's family, meanwhile, made their presence felt in quiet but determined ways. They retained a private attorney to ensure the victim's rights remained visible in pre-trial motions. A restraining order was filed to prevent James's legal team from contacting her extended family. And in the community, a modest memorial event was held. One that didn't dramatize her death but reminded the town that Ashley was more than a name in a docket. She was a mother, a daughter, and, for years, someone who had tried to hold a fractured marriage together under increasing emotional strain. It was during this phase of the investigation that prosecutors revisited Ashley's digital footprint. Her personal journal, synced from her phone to a cloud-based app, revealed entries that would become part of the courtroom narrative. Though not accusatory, they documented fear, not in dramatic tones but in subtle notations. He watches the gas meter again. Seems like he's timing something. The garage door is open again at 3 a.m. They weren't definitive claims, but they established a pattern of unease, one that prosecutors would frame as a contextual backdrop to the crime. The forensic pathologist also amended his original report with an addendum. Ashley's injuries were not consistent with impact from a vehicular crash. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region had a specific shape and angle, suggesting a strike with an object, not contact with a dashboard or windshield. That small clarification, filed quietly, would become central to trial strategy. From the outside, this stage of the process may seem administrative, but in truth, this was the reassembly of a life, Ashley's, piece by piece, as professionals worked to strip away the artificial scene her killer had constructed. Every motion, every finding, every correction to the record brought the story closer to clarity. And in that clarity, there is value, not just in pursuit of justice, but in showing that the truth, once disfigured by fire, can still surface through methodical work. In early 2024, James Schwalm stood before the Ontario Superior Court. There were no theatrics, no plea for forgiveness. He had already admitted guilt, second-degree murder. What remained was formal sentencing and public record. The Crown laid out the case methodically. James had used his firefighting knowledge to plan the murder and disguise it as a car accident. Accelerant traces on Ashley's clothing, burn patterns inside the SUV, and digital search records made the staged scene impossible to defend. She hadn't died in the fire. She was likely unconscious beforehand, unable to escape. Investigators testified about GPS data showing James scouting the burn site. His internet history included searches on vehicle combustion. Surveillance footage showed him buying fuel cans. Every step pointed to premeditation. Ashley's sister delivered a statement. She wanted out. She tried to rebuild her life. But she didn't see how far he'd go to stop her. The judge sentenced James to life in prison, no parole for 14 years. He called James's actions a betrayal of public trust and a calculated act of violence. There were no press conferences, no dramatic conclusions. Ashley's family walked away quietly, their grief now shaped by a permanent absence. This case was never about a sudden outburst. It was about control, calculation, and a system that often fails to see danger when it hides behind a calm face. In the end, stories like Ashley's remind us that danger doesn't always shout. It often whispers behind closed doors. As someone who's spent years piecing together tragedies like this, I've learned that silence is rarely safe. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Speak up, reach out, and never underestimate quiet signs of control or isolation. Lives don't just end in flames, they erode long before that. What do you think we're still missing when it comes to protecting those who want to leave abusive relationships? If this video resonated with you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or just tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't, I'd still love to hear why. If you found value in this story, hit that subscribe button and join me for the next case. Let's keep talking. Let's keep learning.